Chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you for holding this hearing today on pandemic response, waste, fraud, and abuse. I think we can agree on a bipartisan basis that, of course, we want to find out about waste, fraud, and abuse, because in the emergency management business, one of the things we do after a disaster is we do after-action reviews, and we look at what went right and what went wrong to not repeat those same mistakes. And so, when the country began, we're facing an unprecedented whole-of-country crisis, the first 50-state disaster in American history. Every state had a disaster declaration at the same time. The Trump administration was ill-prepared, and in fact, several times wanted the states to take the lead instead of the federal government, specifically when it came to PPE. And so we've heard a lot about fraud and abuse today. I want to focus on the waste. It's not as sexy as fraud and abuse, but the amount of waste that happened during the pandemic, especially in the PPE space, is something that I want to discuss. That void that was created when the states had to step up and procure all these resources, the states had to compete against everybody but Antarctica, but most importantly, the federal government. And while the federal government was raising prices, companies were price gouging the federal government, while the federal government was not following their own procurement. In fact, $18 billion was spent by the Trump administration procuring these goods. $10 billion of that did not go through procurement. It was sole-sourced contracts. And so one of the things I want to talk about as the former director of emergency management for the state of Florida for Governor DeSantis is, did the Inspector General's office, and this question is for you, Mr. Horowitz, did the Inspector General's office ever look at anyone within the inner circle at the White House on whether they were involved in specifically selecting vendors and negotiating pricing for PPE?
So each Inspector General has authority by law in the IG Act over the employees in their building, in their agency. We do not have authority to investigate individuals outside, and there is no Inspector General for the Executive Office of the President or the White House.
Okay, I appreciate that. So let's switch over to the GAO then. Has the GAO examined whether anyone within Trump's inner circle, including family members, were involved in decisions on who should get what contracts and the $10 billion that didn't go through procurement and the pricing that was paid for all sorts of different PPE, whether that be masks or ventilators? I mean, trust me, I've read all of the stuff, but I just want to know, did you guys specifically look at any of that?
No, we did not.
Okay. So what if I proffered for you that when states could not get this PPE out of FEMA or out of HHS, that we had to call the White House to get this stuff released directly from his inner circle? What if I proffered for you? Would that sound like normal procurement process during an emergency?
Probably not.
Right. So, one of the questions that I think we should focus on, Mr. Chairman, in this hearing is that COVID was not a 2-year event. It was a 3-year event. And I am more than happy to join with the majority and look at the fraud and abuse that went on in the last 2 years in COVID-related programs. But I think it's only fair for us to also look at the beginning of the disaster and the amount of government waste that existed by the federal government sole sourcing contracts and negotiating pricing within the White House, subverting the process from federal agencies. Because not only did that drive up cost and waste, that filtered down to the other 50 states. Because if the federal government was paying more money and I wanted to buy those supplies, I had to pay more money. So it isn't just the $18 billion that was spent here, it's the money now that FEMA has to reimburse those states for goods that were too expensive because the federal government drove up those prices. I yield back.